January 1942. The Pacific sleeps beneath a black horizon. The ocean breathes in slow, rhythmic silence, broken only by the hum of distant engines. Somewhere beyond the curvature of the sea, a formation of Japanese bombers slices through the darkness, invisible to every human eye. On a small island outpost, a faint green glow flickers across a round cathode screen. Inside the cramped, humid bunker, two young U.S. Navy operators lean closer. The room smells of sweat and ozone. A pulse of light crawls clockwise across the display. Then a tiny spike appears. One man blinks, unsure if it's a ghost echo. The other calls it in anyway. Within minutes, a phone rings in the control tower. Sirens begin to wail. Searchlights cut the night. Pilots sprint from their bunks. By the time the first Japanese bombers emerge from the darkness, American fighters are already in the air, waiting. For the first time since the war began, Japan's greatest weapon, surprise, has vanished into the static of a new invention. The unseen eyes of America have opened. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, America's military was fighting in the dark, both literally and technologically. The Japanese Empire had perfected the art of striking unseen. From the mists of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Malaya, the Empire's doctrine relied on one unbroken principle: surprise before strength. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been planned with that belief at its core. Japanese pilots trained to navigate by moonlight, timing their raids to the second. The Americans, by contrast, had only a handful of prototype radar sets, most of them untested, misunderstood, or switched off. On the morning of December 7th, one such radar station at Opana Point, Oahu, picked up a large formation approaching from the north. Two young privates reported it. Their warning was dismissed. The blip vanished into memory, moments before the first bombs fell on Battleship Row. It was a moment that defined America's new obsession. Never again would the enemy arrive unseen. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy and Army Signal Corps began a desperate race against time. Laboratories from Boston to San Diego worked around the clock. Out of the chaos of loss came a quiet, technological revolution: the dawn of American radar. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, engineers at the newly formed Radiation Laboratory studied the British chain-home radar network that had saved England during the Battle of Britain. They saw in it not just detection, but an entirely new kind of warfare. A war of electromagnetic sight. The British had used long-wavelength radar, bulky and crude, but effective. The Americans wanted something more compact, more flexible, more powerful. They found their answer in the cavity magnetron, a small device capable of generating microwaves that could detect aircraft with astonishing precision. It was a technology Britain shared with America in 1940, sealing one of the most consequential scientific alliances in history. By early 1942, the first American radar sets, SCR-270 and SCR-271, began appearing across the Pacific. They were cumbersome machines, requiring teams of men and constant calibration. Yet, they offered what no searchlight or patrol could: a warning before the sky turned red. The challenge was not the hardware, it was belief. Many commanders, trained in traditional warfare, distrusted the ghostly images on the screen. Others dismissed radar as unreliable in tropical storms or mountainous terrain. But a few officers, especially in naval aviation, saw its promise immediately. On islands like Midway, Guadalcanal, and New Caledonia, these early believers began wiring together fragile networks of radar coverage, overlapping arcs that could see beyond the horizon. It was imperfect, but it was enough to change the rhythm of war. By mid-1942, Japanese pilots who once trusted the silence of night began to face something uncanny: American interceptors already waiting at altitude. Reports from returning aircrews described invisible observers who somehow anticipated their routes. At first, Tokyo dismissed the rumors as coincidence, but the pattern grew impossible to ignore. Behind the front lines, U.S. engineers refined their systems. They built portable radar units that could be hauled through mud and coral, powering them with noisy generators. Operators were trained not just as technicians, but as sentinels, men who read the invisible tides of war. Each green pulse on the screen became a heartbeat of information. Range, altitude, direction. Every echo turned chaos into prediction. Radar had begun to give America what Japan thought it alone possessed: foresight. But technology alone was not victory. The Pacific was vast, thousands of miles of open sea, scattered islands, and unpredictable weather. For radar to truly matter, it needed to be integrated, with communication, with command, and most of all, with trust. That integration would come through blood, battle, and the lessons of near disaster. By the spring of 1942, the American military was fighting a war of distances, a war that stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. To control such an ocean, the United States needed eyes that could reach far beyond the horizon. Radar became that eye. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the radiation laboratory, RadLab as it was called, turned into one of the most secret scientific hubs of the war. Inside its concrete halls, engineers like Alfred Loomis, Ernest Lawrence, and I. Rabi pushed boundaries of physics under the constant hum of vacuum tubes. They worked 16-hour days, translating raw equations into practical machines the Navy could mount on ships, carriers, and island outposts. Every improvement mattered. A sharper pulse meant another mile of visibility. A smaller magnetron meant one more aircraft could carry the device. The war had become a contest of wavelengths. The side that could see first would survive longest. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the British experience served as both guide and warning. Their chain-home network had protected Britain from the Luftwaffe, but its towers were fixed and vulnerable. The Pacific demanded mobility. American engineers began designing transportable radar, rugged systems that could be unpacked and running within hours. The SCR-270, the same model that had glimpsed the Pearl Harbor attackers, was re-engineered for the field. In March 1942, General Douglas MacArthur ordered radar installations on every operational airfield within his command. The U.S. Navy followed, setting up radar pickets across the Coral Sea. These stations were crude at first, wooden huts perched on cliffs, antenna masts lashed together with rope. But they formed the skeleton of what officers soon called the invisible shield. The challenge was communication. Radar detected the enemy, but someone had to interpret the signals, relay the data, and coordinate fighters in minutes. To solve this, the Americans established the first fighter direction centers, underground bunkers where operators, radio men, and officers worked side by side. Large plotting boards filled with colored markers tracked every detected aircraft. Each move of a pin meant life or death above the sea. Women played a quiet, crucial role. In Hawaii, the Women's Air Raid Defense, WARD, manned night shifts, watching radar scopes for hours. Their precision and calm judgment saved countless lives, though few outside the islands ever knew their names. The Japanese, meanwhile, advanced without knowing any of this was happening. Their early victories had bred confidence. To them, American technology seemed primitive, a nation of industry, not insight. Yet, as they pushed deeper into the Pacific, they began to meet resistance that defied logic. Air raids that should have been unseen were intercepted. Convoys they believed hidden were bombed. Mid-route, captured Japanese reports from 1942 began to mention enemy listening devices and magnetic detectors. Tokyo sent teams to study the mystery, but they underestimated it. The Japanese Navy experimented with crude detection systems, but production delays and secrecy bottlenecks kept them from catching up. By the time prototypes reached testing, American radar had already advanced 2 generations ahead. On the American side, every victory fed confidence. Engineers received combat feedback weekly. Burned-out tubes, interference patterns, calibration errors, and fixed them within days. The collaboration between scientist and soldier had never been closer. This loop of constant refinement turned radar from an experiment into a weapon of precision. By late 1942, from Australia to Midway, a chain of overlapping radar coverage stretched across the Pacific, like invisible barbed wire. Each outpost extended the range of American awareness, creating what strategists later called the first modern information network. For Japanese aviators trained in silence and darkness, it was a change they couldn't yet explain. They began to suspect that the Americans had acquired some unnatural sense, a way to see through clouds, through night, through surprise itself. That suspicion would soon be confirmed in combat, because the next phase of the Pacific War would reveal what radar could truly do when the sky itself became a battlefield. To understand how radar transformed the Pacific War, one must first understand its simplicity and its genius. Radar did not see in color, shape, or form. It measured echoes. A pulse of radio energy was sent into the air, and when it struck a solid object, an aircraft, a ship, even a rain cloud, a tiny fraction bounced back. The time it took to return revealed distance. The angle revealed direction. In 1942, this was nothing short of alchemy. To the operators who stared into those glowing cathode ray screens, radar was like peering into the invisible. There were no computer graphics, no automatic tracking. Every sweep of the green line across the screen had to be interpreted by the human mind, a living, breathing processor of patterns. Each operator developed instinct. A steady blip might be weather. A rhythmic pulse meant planes. 2 converging lines of blips meant a raid. The best of them could tell formation types by rhythm alone. Heavy bombers pulsed slower. Nimble fighters faster. What radar gave America was not just detection. It gave time. 5 minutes of warning meant pilots could start their engines. 10 minutes meant they could climb to interception altitude. In a war where seconds decided survival, radar turned panic into preparation. The Japanese war doctrine had been built on surprise. Their pilots trained for pre-dawn assaults, believing that darkness itself was a weapon. But radar broke that advantage. It turned night from a shield into a mirror. On islands like Guadalcanal, radar operators became as vital as the men flying above them. A radar crew could detect incoming aircraft 100 miles away, direct interceptors by radio, and adjust in real time as the battle unfolded. These operators rarely saw combat, yet their decisions decided it. One of the earliest demonstrations of this new power came in 1942, when radar-directed fighters intercepted Japanese bombers approaching Guadalcanal before sunrise. The Japanese expected confusion. They met precision instead. American fighters were already climbing into attack positions, guided by voices from dark rooms hundreds of miles away. The Japanese commander, believing he had approached undetected, lost half his squadron before daylight. From that moment onward, the Imperial Japanese Navy began to realize it was facing an opponent who could see without seeing. The technical leap that made this possible lay within the cavity magnetron, a device small enough to fit in a shoebox, yet powerful enough to flood the sky with microwaves. It was the beating heart of American radar evolution. While early systems like the SCR-270 used longer wavelengths, the magnetron allowed for shorter, sharper pulses. It meant smaller antennas, higher resolution, and the ability to detect even a single aircraft in formation. This innovation came directly from cooperation with Britain. In 1940, the British government had delivered a magnetron prototype to the United States, a gift of science in the darkest year of the war. The Americans industrialized it, mass-producing what Britain could only build by hand. This marriage of British innovation and American industry gave rise to the most advanced detection systems the world had ever seen. Naval radar soon followed. The U.S. Navy began fitting its destroyers and carriers with surface search radar, allowing them to spot enemy ships in storms or at night. During convoy operations, radar became the silent guardian. A ship could navigate through fog, coordinate formation changes, and even lock onto enemy vessels through the dark. But it wasn't just equipment. Radar introduced a new kind of soldier, part technician, part strategist. These men were trained to think abstractly, to visualize invisible battlefields in their minds. Their communication with pilots required clarity, calm, and absolute trust. Vector to intercept, they would say, giving bearing and altitude in clipped tones. For the pilots above, that voice was often the difference between ambush and defense. By 1943, the synergy between radar and air power had matured. Night fighter squadrons used airborne radar to hunt enemy planes in total darkness. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 coordinated carrier air defenses across hundreds of miles using radar networks. For the first time in human history, combat was being guided by invisible information. Not sight. Not sound, but electromagnetic foresight. The Japanese, bound by doctrine and pride, struggled to understand it. Their scientists had experimented with rudimentary systems, but Japan's industrial base lacked the raw materials, copper, vacuum tubes, precision parts, to produce them in quantity. Their planes continued to rely on visual spotting, even in the dark, even when radar-guided American fighters struck first. Radar was no longer just a machine. It had become an extension of human perception, an artificial instinct woven into warfare. And as America expanded its radar coverage island by island, the Japanese realized too late that they were fighting an enemy who had redefined what it meant to see. War is not only a clash of weapons, it is a clash of understanding. For the Japanese pilots who entered the skies of the Pacific, their mastery lay in precision, discipline, and stealth. Their tactics were built upon invisibility, approach from the sun, strike from the dark, retreat before retaliation. For months after Pearl Harbor, this method seemed invincible. Then, suddenly, it stopped working. Reports began to reach Tokyo. Formations that should have taken the enemy by surprise were being intercepted miles offshore. Night raids were met by searchlights that swung into position before the first bomb was dropped. Aircraft lost contact with each other in confusion as American fighters seemed to appear from nowhere. To the pilots in their cockpits, it felt supernatural. Many assumed American intelligence had broken codes, or that spotters on the ground had betrayed them. Few imagined that the cause was a humming box of circuits hidden in bunkers or bolted inside aircraft noses. Captured Japanese airmen later recalled their disbelief. They spoke of American interceptors that rose before dawn like ghosts, of attacks guided as if by second sight. In the strict hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, such failures were often explained as shame or fate, not technology. That denial cost them dearly. On the American side, radar transformed not only warfare, but the psychology of war. It replaced fear with control. In the early months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific felt endless, a void where enemy planes could appear at any hour. The advent of radar turned that fear into data. The unknown became measurable. The invisible became manageable. Radar rooms became sanctuaries of quiet tension. Inside, men and women worked in darkness, lit only by screens and red bulbs. Conversations were minimal. Concentration, absolute. The faint beeps and sweeps became their heartbeat. In those moments, they were not just observers, they were guardians of the horizon. Many of these operators were barely out of high school. Trained in weeks, they carried responsibilities once reserved for senior officers. When an incoming formation appeared, every decision had a chain reaction. A delayed report could cost a squadron. A misread signal could doom a convoy. The calm required to interpret that data under pressure made them invisible heroes of the Pacific War. Yet the human strain was real. Long hours, tropical heat, and isolation wore them down. Radar operators often slept beside their machines, headphones still around their necks. They wrote letters home describing the hum that never stops and the green glow that follows into dreams. In a war remembered for brutal ground combat and sea battles, their struggle was quieter but no less vital. The introduction of radar also forced American commanders to rethink how they fought. No longer reactive, they could now anticipate. Entire operations, from convoy movements to air cover strategies, were planned around radar data. The Pacific began to feel smaller, less mysterious, more controllable. For the Japanese, this shift was devastating. Their entire doctrine relied on the element of shock. Every raid, every ambush was a psychological weapon. But when the enemy could see them coming, even before dawn, that psychological edge vanished. It bred frustration and confusion. Commanders scolded crews for sloppy execution, when in truth, it was technology, not error, undoing them. A captured diary from a Japanese pilot at Rabaul, dated late 1943, described the experience in haunting terms. They knew, always they knew. Even before sunrise, they were waiting. It is as if they can hear the air itself. That realization marked the beginning of an irreversible decline in Japanese air dominance. In parallel, radar redefined leadership. Officers who once relied on instinct learned to trust invisible signals. Some resisted, calling radar unreliable trickery. But the results were undeniable. Battles that once ended in disaster began to tilt in America's favor. Commanders started requesting radar coverage as urgently as ammunition or fuel. There was also a moral undercurrent. Radar reduced the chaos of battle. Pilots could be guided home through storms, ships could avoid collisions at night, and air raids could be intercepted with fewer civilian casualties. Technology, for once, offered both advantage and restraint. But the most profound effect was on perception itself. For the first time, war had entered the electromagnetic spectrum, a dimension beyond human senses. Soldiers began to speak of seeing in the dark, of fighting ghosts with ghosts. The line between man and machine blurred, and the Pacific became a testing ground for a new era of warfare. Information warfare. Information warfare. By late 1943, the Japanese knew they were fighting a different kind of enemy, not one of superior numbers alone, but of superior awareness. The Americans had learned to weaponize knowledge. The shift was not loud or explosive. It came quietly, like the faint sweep of a radar beam across a dark screen. Invisible, patient, inevitable. And it would soon culminate in a moment when that invisible power would determine the outcome of an entire battle. June 4, 1942. The Pacific was still dark when the Battle of Midway began. At 4:30 a.m., long before dawn touched the horizon, Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu prepared to launch the strike that would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet once and for all. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was meticulous, a mirror of Pearl Harbor's success. Surprise, precision, destruction. But this time, the Americans were waiting. On the tiny atoll of Midway, radar antennae turned silently in the pre-dawn wind. In a bunker lined with equipment, U.S. Navy operators watched the sweeping green trace of their SCR-270 scope. At 4:30 a.m., a faint group of blips appeared 150 miles out, then more behind them. The operator leaned in, counted, checked, and called it in. Enemy planes detected. Bearing 320. Distance 150 miles. Within minutes, radios came alive. Fighters scrambled. Anti-aircraft crews took positions. Commanders marked enemy bearings on plotting boards. For the first time in naval history, a fleet would fight a battle guided by electronic eyes. The Japanese formation advanced, unaware. Their pilots expected silence, confusion, chaos, the same unprepared enemy they had crushed at Pearl Harbor. Instead, they found an alert and ready defense. By the time the first Japanese bombs fell, American fighters were already airborne, diving into formation. The attack still inflicted damage, but the timing, the entire rhythm of the battle, had changed. The element of surprise was gone. Radar had given Admiral Chester Nimitz what Yamamoto once possessed: anticipation. The battle unfolded across hundreds of miles of open ocean, where vision meant survival. Aircraft searched for carriers they could not see. Every minute of direction mattered. Here, radar provided not just defense, but coordination. American spotters, aided by radar readings, guided torpedo bombers through clouds toward the enemy's position. When the first Japanese carriers were hit by dive bombers later that morning, it was not coincidence. It was the cumulative power of intelligence, timing, and invisible detection. Radar's impact at Midway wasn't perfect. Equipment failed, readings lagged, and operators fought interference from heat and humidity. Yet, the concept had proven itself. The U.S. Navy had turned technology into foresight, and foresight into victory. After Midway, the tide of war began to turn. Japan never again launched an offensive of equal scale. But the lessons of radar were just beginning to unfold. Later that year, in the Solomon Islands, a new generation of radar-guided operations took the concept further. On Guadalcanal, the Americans built radar posts on high ridges, manned by Marines and engineers who learned to read the faintest signals. At Henderson Field, radar operators worked side by side with air controllers in makeshift command huts, relaying instructions to pilots mid-flight. One of those early morning intercepts became legendary among U.S. squadrons. At 5:00 a.m., radar picked up a large formation of Japanese bombers inbound from Rabaul. Still 120 miles away, the call went out. American Wildcats and P-38s took off in darkness. Using vector instructions from radar operators, they climbed to 20,000 feet, directly into the bomber's path. When the sun rose minutes later, the Japanese found themselves under attack from above, not below. They had been outmaneuvered by men who never saw them with their eyes. One Japanese pilot, captured weeks later, said simply, "We believed we came from the night, but the night now belonged to them." That statement became symbolic of radar's psychological power. It reversed fear. What once favored stealth now favored detection. In a matter of months, the Americans began fitting radar not only on ships and island stations, but directly into aircraft. Night fighters like the P-61 Black Widow carried airborne radar sets that could track enemy planes in real time. The Japanese still flew by instinct and eyesight. The Americans now fought by data. Each radar-guided interception sent ripples through Japanese command. Reports described impossible encounters. Bombers ambushed in total darkness. Fighters guided with precision through storm and cloud. It wasn't magic. It was magnetrons, math, and men who trusted the unseen. By 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy finally recognized the scope of what they faced. Engineers rushed to replicate radar, but their efforts came too late. America's production capacity dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. Where the Japanese might deploy a dozen units, the U.S. produced thousands. The Pacific, vast, unpredictable, and merciless, had become a laboratory for a new age of warfare. Battles were no longer decided solely by firepower, but by who saw first, who reacted faster. Who turned information into action? Radar had changed not only the battle, it had changed the very definition of what it meant to fight. By 1943, the balance of the Pacific sky had shifted so quietly that many did not notice until it was too late. Japanese pilots who once flew with total confidence now returned to their bases shaken and confused. Their squadrons, built on the belief in surprise and precision, were being dismantled mid-air by an enemy they could not see and could not understand. The turning point came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. Japanese transport, convoys, carrying troops from Rabaul to Leh, moved under cover of darkness, believing the ocean and the night would shield them. But high above the sea, American B-24 bombers, guided by radar-equipped reconnaissance aircraft and coastal stations, had already plotted their course. At dawn, the U.S. 5th Air Force struck with surgical precision. Radar had allowed commanders to coordinate bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes in perfect sequence. Within hours, the Japanese convoy was annihilated. 8 transports and 4 destroyers sunk. Over 3,000 men perished. Few ever reached Leh. The Japanese survivors were stunned. For them, the night and the ocean had always been allies. Elements that hid their movement, preserved their secrecy. Now, both had turned against them. One officer later wrote in his log, "They find us even when no one should. It is as though they have eyes above the clouds." That phrase captured the disbelief echoing through Japanese command centers. Tokyo's scientists scrambled for explanations. Some suggested spies. Others suspected code breakers or divine luck. A handful guessed the truth, electromagnetic detection. But Japan lacked the industrial foundation to respond quickly. American radar, meanwhile, was growing smaller, faster, and deadlier. Ships now carried fire control radar that could lock onto targets in pitch darkness. The Navy's new SG radar guided guns with precision once unimaginable. Destroyers began intercepting enemy ships at night, turning what had once been Japan's domain, the Midnight Sea, into an American battlefield. The psychological reversal was total. For the Japanese, night raids and surprise landings had once been a source of pride. Now they were a gamble against an invisible opponent. Pilots spoke of phantom warnings, where American defenses seemed to react before any visual contact. They began changing flight paths, lowering altitude, flying through storms. Nothing worked. The Americans always knew. In the skies over Bougainville, a radar-guided squadron of P-61 Black Widows intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers attempting a pre-dawn attack. The radar operators aboard the U.S. fighters calmly tracked the incoming aircraft at 18 miles out, relaying positions through headphones. When the bombers entered range, the night lit up with tracer fire. Not one Japanese aircraft escaped. It was at that moment, more than any single battle, that Japanese Air Command accepted a grim reality. They no longer owned the element of surprise. The war reports that followed read like an obituary for an old way of fighting. Enemy aircraft detected before sunrise. Bombers intercepted prior to arrival. Convoys attacked despite radio silence. Each line was a quiet testament to radar's victory and to Japan's growing despair. By late 1943, Japan began deploying primitive radar systems of its own, but they were few and unreliable. Shortages of critical components, frequent power failures, and poor training rendered them nearly useless. Even when detection worked, communication breakdowns delayed responses. America, by contrast, had turned radar into a synchronized language of war, operators, pilots, and ships working as one organism. The gap was not just technological, it was psychological. The Japanese had built their doctrine around human excellence, the precision of pilots, the courage of sailors, the honor of surprise. America had built a system, a network of machines and men that compensated for human limits. The war was revealing a new truth. Courage alone could no longer win against information. By 1944, this truth became visible from the Mariana Islands to the Philippines. Japanese pilots approaching Saipan and Leyte found themselves ambushed before even reaching attack altitude. The Americans were reading the sky in waves and echoes. Battles that once began with a surprise strike now began with radar alerts. The U.S. fleet operated as if it had a sixth sense. When captured, Japanese officers were interrogated. After the war, many described radar not as a machine but as a mystery. It made no noise, one said, but it always knew we were there. That realization marked the true end of Japanese air supremacy. Their mastery of stealth and strategy had been undone by invisible precision. The Pacific, once ruled by silence and shadow, now belonged to those who could see without light. When the echoes of the Bismarck Sea faded and the wreckage settled beneath the waves, a new kind of warfare had already taken root. Radar, once dismissed as a laboratory curiosity, had become as vital to victory as aircraft carriers and fuel. It was the unseen commander of every major engagement that followed. By late 1943, radar stations dotted every major American foothold across the Pacific. From Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, from the Solomons to the Marshalls, an invisible web of detection stretched over thousands of miles. Each outpost extended the reach of American awareness. What had begun as a handful of experimental devices now functioned as an interlinked network, the world's first real-time intelligence grid. Information flowed from island to island, ship to ship, and cockpit to command. For the first time in military history, a commander could visualize the movement of enemies he could not see. In Hawaii, the same island once attacked without warning. Massive radar dishes now stood watch over the Pacific routes. They could detect incoming aircraft hundreds of miles away. A promise that the disaster of 1941 would never repeat. The United States had learned its lesson, and it had learned it well, but the effect was deeper than protection. Radar began changing the way Americans thought about war itself. Until then, battles had been reactions, flashes of violence and chaos. Now, the U.S. military could shape those moments, timing every response with data rather than instinct. Commanders began planning offensives around radar windows, tracking weather, timing launches, and adjusting formations with precision once unimaginable. For the men on the front lines, the difference was tangible. Fighter pilots no longer climbed blindly into the dark. They climbed toward coordinates. Ships no longer fired at silhouettes. They fired at echoes. Convoys that once feared night attacks now sailed under radar watch, confident in unseen guardians overhead. The Japanese, meanwhile, watched this transformation with disbelief and dread. Their own radar research, though earnest, was crippled by shortages and secrecy. Japan's scientists developed several radar models, the Type 2 Mark II and Type 3 Mark I among them. But these came too late, and too few were deployed to matter. By the time Japan's radar eyes opened, the American sky was already filled with them. Captured intelligence after the war revealed the desperation of Japan's technological race. Laboratories in Tokyo had reverse-engineered fragments of downed Allied equipment. They tried to replicate magnetrons, but the scarcity of copper, aluminum, and high-quality vacuum tubes made mass production impossible. The Japanese army, fighting on multiple fronts, simply couldn't keep pace with the industrial avalanche of American innovation. As radar coverage expanded, so did its applications. The Navy began to use radar for navigation during long Pacific voyages, ensuring formations could travel safely through storms or night maneuvers. Destroyers equipped with SG surface search radar became the eyes of the fleet, detecting enemy ships miles before visual sighting. Battleships used fire control radar to aim, guns with precision even in total darkness, transforming night combat from chaos into choreography. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, radar coordination reached its zenith. American carriers, protected by radar picket destroyers, detected the incoming Japanese air armada hours before contact. When the enemy finally appeared, U.S. fighters were already climbing. The battle turned into one of the most lopsided aerial defeats in history. Over 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. America lost barely 30. The result was not just tactical. It was psychological annihilation. Japanese pilots, who once considered themselves the masters of the sky, returned home shattered. They had been outflown not by superior skill, but by superior vision. Radar had reversed the roles of hunter and hunted. It was no longer the Japanese Zero appearing from the sun, but the American Hellcat emerging from the dark. From the decks of aircraft carriers to the isolated radar huts on coral atolls, the men who operated this new technology felt both pride and unease. They had turned war into a science, precise, predictive, almost detached. Yet they understood that their screens represented real lives, real deaths. Each blip erased by a pilot's radio confirmation meant another man, another machine, gone. Still, the operators kept watching, kept listening. Because in a war of distances, seeing first meant living longer. And as 1944 turned to 1945, the radar networks that stretched across the Pacific would pave the way for America's final push toward Japan itself. A march illuminated not by sunlight, but by the glow of a green screen. By 1945, radar had become the silent pulse of American power. Every ship, every airfield, every carrier task force beat in rhythm with it. What had once been a handful of isolated stations was now a living nervous system stretching across the Pacific Ocean. It could feel the movement of fleets hundreds of miles away, track storms, predict enemy raids, and guide bombers through darkness. This invisible network gave America an advantage that went far beyond numbers or weapons. It gave awareness. Awareness meant initiative, and initiative meant victory. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, proved how deep this transformation ran. Japanese forces launched their final major offensive, a desperate attempt to repel the U.S. invasion of the Philippines. Yet even before their ships came within striking range, American radar pickets had detected them. Destroyers and cruisers tracked multiple enemy fleets simultaneously, guiding aircraft to intercept. In the chaos of smoke and thunder, radar screens glowed like beacons of order, each sweep mapping an invisible battlefield. It was the first time in naval history that a battle of such scale was orchestrated through electronic awareness. The Japanese Navy fought bravely, but blindly. Their commanders could only guess where the enemy was. The Americans knew. When the guns fell silent, Japan's naval power was effectively destroyed. From that point on, radar became the quiet heartbeat of every Allied operation. It guided amphibious landings on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, allowing ships to detect kamikaze formations before they struck. It helped B-29 superfortresses navigate their long, perilous routes over the Pacific, even when weather swallowed the stars. It kept fleets coordinated across vast distances where visual contact was impossible. But radar's triumph was not just technological, it was philosophical. It redefined the human relationship with war. For the first time, battles were being fought and won by people who might never see their enemy with their own eyes. Victory was measured not by courage in the cockpit or the trench, but by clarity on a screen. This shift troubled some veterans. Pilots and sailors who had lived by instinct now fought by signal. "We fight shadows," one officer wrote, "and win against men we never see." Yet even he admitted that radar saved lives, thousands of them. Every early warning meant fewer ambushes, fewer lost ships, fewer widows waiting for letters that would never come. The Japanese military's inability to counter radar symbolized the broader collapse of its war machine. Japan had entered World War II with one of the most advanced navies in the world, fast, precise, and fearless. But war is not static. What began as a test of courage became a test of innovation. And in that race, America surged ahead. Even as Japanese engineers built their own radar sets, they faced crippling shortages. Allied bombing had crippled their factories. Copper, tungsten, and quality glass were scarce. Without these, radar could not function. Japan's radar systems never reached the range, resolution, or reliability of their American counterparts. In the final months of the war, they relied more on visual spotters than on instruments, a fatal disadvantage. Meanwhile, the United States was already thinking beyond detection. Radar-guided bombs and proximity fuses were introduced, using the same principles of reflection and timing. Anti-aircraft shells now exploded when they sensed an aircraft nearby, not when a gunner guessed the range. This new precision changed anti-air warfare forever. By August 1945, as B-29s appeared over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, radar stations were tracking their paths in real time. For the Japanese defenders on the ground, there was no mystery left, only inevitability. The skies no longer belonged to men. They belonged to machines. After Japan's surrender, radar remained, not as a weapon, but as a promise. It became the backbone of a new world order. Air traffic control, weather forecasting, missile guidance, and early warning defense systems. The same technology that had once spotted bombers over the Pacific now guided commercial planes over peaceful skies. Yet the men who had manned those first radar screens rarely spoke of what they'd done. They were not aces or heroes in headlines. Their victories came in silence, in the cold hum of generators and the steady rotation of antennae beneath tropical rain. But without them, there would have been no dawn victories, no Midway, no Leyte, no end to the Pacific War when it came. Radar had not just seen the enemy, it had seen the future. It had seen the future. War often ends not with the roar of engines or the thunder of guns, but with silence. A silence filled with memory. When the Pacific finally grew still in 1945, the world stood on the edge of something new. The ocean that had once swallowed fleets in shadow was now mapped by invisible waves. Humanity had learned to see beyond sight itself. Radar was not built to destroy. It was built to understand, to measure distance, to find what could not be found. Yet, in the crucible of war, it became the most powerful weapon of all: foresight. The Japanese pilots who once ruled the skies came to fear a machine they could neither see nor outfly. The Americans who built and operated it learned a quieter kind of courage, the discipline to trust signals over instincts, mathematics over emotion. In their green-lit rooms, far from the noise of battle, they watched the world change one sweep at a time. In the years that followed, the same technology that guided bombers began guiding lives. Airports used it to bring travelers home through fog. Meteorologists used it to track storms before they struck. Scientists used it to study planets and galaxies. Radar, born from fear, became an instrument of safety. And yet, the memory of its first purpose remains, a reminder that every new way of seeing changes the way humanity fights and the way it survives. When the Japanese pilots flew into the Pacific night, they believed darkness was their ally. They were wrong, because somewhere on a quiet island, inside a dimly lit bunker, a young American operator sat before a glowing screen, watching, waiting, listening to the hum of a world that could finally see itself coming. The night had ended, and with it, an old kind of war.